To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod.
Welcome to the Death Panel. Patrons, thank you. Your support truly makes this show possible, and we couldn't do any of this without you. If you value our work and you want to help us keep this project going, become a patron. We rely on listeners like you to sustain the show. Join at patreon.com/deathpanelpod and get access to weekly bonus episodes and our full back catalog with hundreds of hours of bonus content. And to help us out some more, post about your favorite episodes, pick up copies of Health Communism, A Short History of Trans Misogyny, and Abolish Rent at your local bookstore, or request them at your local library, hold reading or discussion groups, share the show with someone who needs to hear it, and of course, you can also follow us at deathpanel_. I'm Beatrice Sadler-Bolton, and I'm here today with my co-hosts, Artie Vierkant.
Hello.
And Phil Rocco.
Hey.
And today, the three of us are going to be checking back in on the coordinated attacks by the American right on entitlement programs, which make up the core of the social welfare state. Over the past few weeks, we've seen the press scramble to make some sort of sense of Trump and Elon Musk's so-called Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, and what it actually is or is not doing. Despite the absurdity of its name and Musk's usual theatrics, the project's mission is being given a shocking amount of credibility, even in reporting that is highly critical of its approach, or specifically drawing attention to the way that this has been straining against the norms and laws of the United States. Even when critical about the way they're going about things, every day another journalist breathlessly repeats Musk's supposed findings of waste, fraud, and abuse, lending DOGE additional credulity in the process of critiquing them. Reporting on DOGE's claims that so far they've deleted billions in quote-unquote wasteful spending, or entire agencies or procedures riddled with inefficiencies, is often delivered without any scrutiny, as if the apartheid billionaire dilettante who has built his fortune by buying companies which leech money out of the state through government contracts, subsidies, and handouts is suddenly an expert in and genuinely finding and eliminating widespread fraud that has been wasting federal resources to the tune of billions of dollars. But while this might be an obvious point for longtime listeners of Death Panel, it's important to emphasize right here at the top that this crusade has never been about making the government more efficient or seeking out and eliminating waste. That agenda that DOGE is claiming is a farce. It's actually just the latest volley in an old war of state austerity, waged through messaging, reporting, congressional grandstanding, and public relations. It's always been about softening the ground for massive rollbacks of public spending, where the targeting and even potential elimination of entire social programs can be framed as simple budgetary housekeeping, an age-old narrative that America is simply responsibly balancing its checkbook through scaling up organized abandonment. And we already know where this is headed. Later on in the episode, we're going to be discussing how both individual states and Republicans in Congress are wasting no time calling for work requirements, which move us toward deep cuts to Medicaid, a long-standing target, and the right's fixation on waste, fraud, and abuse is once again being trotted out to justify it. While these terms might at first sound neutral, technocratic, or even part of a necessary agenda, as we're going to talk about, this phrase, waste, fraud, and abuse, always runs rhetorical cover for targeting and withdrawing resources from the people who need them most. So today, we're going to be taking a closer look at how the press is laundering this project, why they're treating Musk's grift like a real governance initiative instead of the eugenic austerity project that it really is, and how the same logic is being used to justify the renewed push to gut Medicaid via the implementation of work requirements, which was a materially disastrous fixture of the last Trump administration.
Yeah, and I think before we get into that conversation today, I think like last week, it would be good to just do some what has happened in the last week rundown too. So just I think
can we put the like the sort of like newsreel music below?
Or the Benny Hill music?
Yeah, the more appropriate.
Yeah. So since we last spoke, this isn't going to be a comprehensive rundown, obviously, but I think just a few things pertinent to our discussion. Since we last spoke, NIH has instituted even further cuts at the behest of DOGE, putting the future of countless, not just studies, but entire labs, science labs in jeopardy, with a lot of universities set to lose tens of millions in federal funding. Not just places like Ivy's, critically, but state schools and all manner of other places, because this happens all over the country. The CDC's morbidity and mortality weekly reports have resumed, but without key bird flu studies, which appear to have just been straight up censored at this point. So now I think we can assume if an H5 outbreak becomes efficient at spreading in humans, it's going to be up to state health agencies to be reporting it, which is not a great sign. Also, Trump said he is, quote, committed to buying and owning Gaza after first floating the idea in a press conference with Netanyahu. We had little Marco's tweets, the DOGE staffer infiltrating Treasury, what we talked about last week, turned out to have tweets reading things like, quote, just for the record, I was racist before it was cool, unquote, and quote, I just want a eugenic immigration policy. Is that too much to ask, unquote.
As if you didn't already have one in the United States.
Right.
True. Though, just to say, for anyone who's ever said B and I overuse the term eugenics, I'm sorry, but, I'm not going to make up another word for the thing that they also themselves say they want. Anyway, apparently Marco, the staffer in question, resigned last week, but may be coming back in as both Elon Musk and JD Vance started posting about wanting to rehire him regardless of the tweets. Shout out to friend of the show, Nathan Tankus, by the way, for all of his reporting that helped get Marco ousted in the first place. Meanwhile, also, there are signs all over polite society of, as they say, obeying in advance. More providers have stepped in to drop youth trans care, like at both NYU and Mount Sinai in New York, following similar moves at VCU. Also in New York City Health and Hospitals, the city's public health system, issued a memo warning staff not to help patients avoid ICE apprehension, and that staff should just allow ICE entrance to the hospital systems if they ask, even though ICE is legally not allowed to enter without a warrant. And then I suppose to tie things right back into the sort of main topic today, Politico also reported this weekend that, quote, centrists and even some more conservative Republicans are increasingly alarmed that House Representative Jody Arrington keeps raising Medicare reforms as a potential spending offset, which basically further confirms prior reporting from a few weeks ago that Arrington was circulating plans to cut almost $500 billion out of Medicare and potentially $2.3 trillion out of Medicaid. Just repeating what the reporting says, that's just like an absurd figure. But, in any case, I think this kind of brings us back to what B was setting up for us, which is, even with all of this happening, so many of the new administration's attacks on the administrative state, whether it's, DOGE stuff or stuff that they're doing in concert with House and Senate Republicans, have just been portrayed as these cost-cutting measures, as though that's this sort of neutral thing, targeting quote-unquote waste, fraud, and abuse. Even as we're going to sit down to record, for example, I went and refreshed the New York Times to see whatever their most recent coverage of DOGE was, and the title of the piece, the first piece that I found, earnestly referred to it as, quote, Elon Musk's government cost-cutting effort.
Yeah, they can't seem to quit taking the efficiency hustle seriously. I heard a similar kind of framing on NPR, and I think that, this is one of the kind of fascinating, I think, features of this. It's so obviously nakedly a means of just arrogating power and likely just protecting individual private fortunes of the people who are now running government. But I think legacy media is, for whatever reason, by calculation or osmosis, the administration has figured out that you can tap into this seam of mock concern that legacy media just has with issues like efficiency. Somehow it just it hits them in the zone of your brain that is ASMR. It's ASMR for oh, you talk about the deficit or efficiency or something, and it just hits the NPR coverage right in the good spot.
Yeah, I was thinking of waste, fraud, and abuse as being sort of the unholy mantra of the federal state. Just repeat this invocation over and over again until and as long as it means something. No, but I mean,
or until it becomes true, they're manifesting.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Manifesting. No, but so it's relevant, I think, to say, as B sort of already did in the intro. It's very clear. First of all, I mean, they may say that they're targeting waste, fraud, and abuse, but it's very clear, first of all, that what they're trying to squeeze these programs for, what they're very upfront about, is that they're doing this kind of, in trying to put forward this new budget proposal, they're trying to sort of redistribute social spending from, supportive programs to things like financing an extension of the first term Trump tax credit and to fund basically mass deportations and their like Hitlerian border security policies. And then, on top of that, I think just very plainly by waste and fraud, when they are identifying whatever quote unquote waste or quote unquote fraud is in these programs, what they mean is usually this benefit went to someone whose, political beliefs or skin color or gender we don't like.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it doesn't help that the sort of like waste, fraud, and abuse and like reinventing government, so to speak, has been something that Democrats too, since, I think at least the Clinton era, if not earlier, have made part of their party's sort of brand. And that's certainly, arguments about sort of the illegitimacy of like welfare recipients in the 1990s. And even the thought that like that had gone away in sort of the Obama era and thereafter. I mean, it's certainly the case that when Democrats get pushed on this, when they get brought on to NPR or wherever, they can't immediately go to this is clearly just a means of throwing people off of programs that they are legally entitled to be on, or like this is depriving people of their rights. Like they have to at least like feint in the direction of like, well, of course there are things in government that like, need to be made more efficient, right? Like it's something that's just like part of Democrats' DNA as well, which of course doesn't make it easy for them, or I think makes it a little bit harder for them to be sort of more aggressive and robust. And I think it shows to some extent when you look at like public opinion on things like Medicaid work requirements or whatever, like even in super Democrat strongholds in like Wisconsin, an advisory referendum on like putting work requirements into like all social programs, which they're already there in all of them except Medicaid, like won overwhelmingly in like super blue, but like affluent areas. So it's like, I think that at sort of a political level, Democrats are have policy platformed their way into being very bad at fighting on this issue.
Absolutely.
And at risk of beating a dead horse, I think it's just important to talk about how, like, just as a top line, this is not a budgetary project that Musk is running. This is an ideological project.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
This is also an ideology that, as Artie was saying, is deeply rooted in eugenics, right? And if we actually look back to the very beginning of eugenics, we're often always like focused on talking about reproductive control. But as I was talking about with Jess Watcutt in our recent discussion of their book, the policy angle of eugenics was always primary. And that's the part of eugenics that has been the most persistent. And so I think it's often the part of the eugenic project that is the least acknowledged, because it's an incredibly useful, frame if you're trying to kind of consolidate resources and consolidate power. It's taken as common sense. It's just a fact of life, right? Like people just believe eugenic ideology is real and is important and is how the world works. Like survival of the fittest. This is just how it goes. There are some people who are just leeching off of everyone else, and that the government is just letting it happen. I think it was amazing that some of the biggest pushback we got to health communism was people saying, well, there is genuine waste, fraud, and abuse out there. There are people stealing millions of dollars from Medicaid. And it's like, okay, well, you're pointing to like one instance of fraudulent payments, and you're painting that as like what is actually being sought out and targeted, when in actuality, if you look at how this rhetoric is used over and over and over again, they're not looking for doctors who are upcharging, right? Like they are targeting
That's going to continue.
people.
You can expect that to continue unabated.
Right.
Absolutely. Like
the actual source of any fraud in Medicare, for example, or Medicaid.
Payments, yes.
Right. This is about the targeted elimination of people who are unfit, right? Of human waste, not of wasteful spending and charges, right? And this isn't new territory for Musk. I think it's also worth saying. He has this very long history of promoting, IQ, pseudoscience, endorsing rhetoric about population control and paranoia about overpopulation, propagating ableist ideas about intelligence and productivity as the measure of a person's worth.
I mean, he's also been literally tweeting basically in the last couple of weeks in promotion of like returning South Africa to apartheid status. So, I mean,
Exactly. And And eugenics has always been tied to austerity and state building. Every time the ruling class moves to dismantle social spending, they do so through a narrative that frames disabled, poor, elderly, or non-working people for whatever reason as burdens that society cannot afford to carry. So when they say they're cutting waste, they mean they're cutting people off from survival. The goal isn't just to reduce government spending, but to make the state into a machine that serves only the productive class. Those who accumulate capital, those who are quote unquote valuable in the eyes of folks like Musk, and while pushing everyone else onto the kind of terms of precarity that will frankly shift the labor market in ways that are important to consider in this whole thing. Medicaid is at the center of this attack because it represents a direct challenge to the ideology of waste, fraud, and abuse, particularly Medicaid expansion to quote-unquote working populations, because however flawed Medicaid is as a system, and I'm not saying Medicaid is perfect, it allows people to survive outside of these narrow constraints of capitalist work coercive disciplines, right? If we think of so many people on Medicaid work part-time jobs, work in the food service industry, working as farm workers, right? This is a massive subsidy for low-income employment already, but it really takes this acceleration of the dismantling of Medicaid and puts it in the proper light to be like, no, we need to talk about this in terms of a broader eugenic project, not just rooting out fraudulent payments here and there that add up to some sort of budgetary total that if it didn't exist, the United States would be broadly more prosperous. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I think that a lot can be learned by the constraints on rhetoric about proposals requiring people to go through all of these onerous work requirement validation procedures for Medicaid, because we have two really, I think, divergent things going on right now. So the waste, fraud, and abuse conversation on Medicaid is going in kind of the legislative arena. You have members of Congress like Senator John Kennedy from Louisiana basically sort of saying what had been the quiet part loud, because they have no constraints. They don't have to argue that this is legal under current Medicaid policy, as states that want to implement this do. They can just make whatever argument they want. And so when they're unconstrained, they're just going after what you can see is going to be the top line thing that they framed to people as why they need to do this. And the argument that Kennedy made in introducing this proposal in Congress was that the number one thing for why they needed to do this in Medicaid was that workforce participation had been going down since the early 2000s. That's the number one thing. Now, the really fascinating work that performs is to completely re-narrate why workforce participation has decreased since the early 2000s. Namely, in addition to the fact that you have a larger aging population, which means fewer people in paid work, it's largely offshoring and automation that is meant that essentially you can have things like jobless recoveries when you have brief periods of economic recession. So you no longer have to talk about exactly what capitalists are doing to change the nature of the labor force. You can attribute lower workforce participation and all of the sort of things that people, sort of the arguments that people make at the sort of grocery store level of just people don't want to work anymore, to a benefits program whose only function really is to marginally decommodify labor. Not even in a really significant way, because there's still a very sharp means tested cap on it, but it in a very limited way decommodifies labor because, of course, most of the people who are on Medicaid work.
Right. And I think what's important is that this is also being presented as a quest to root out corruption, right? Because
Yes,
there's the moral angle here that's really important, and this is always a huge part of what the invocation of waste, fraud, and abuse actually means, right? This has been used for decades as ideological cover for, targeting people who fit into, whether we're talking about various sort of societal boogeymen like Reagan's welfare queens, right? This kind of idea that, this is not just about actual waste of money, but of human waste, as I said earlier, the kind of idea that there are people in the United States who are getting something that they don't deserve, and that is the source of misery and suffering for, the working class broadly. It's a narrative around waste that's highly selective, right? Like they're never talking about, military budgets, corporate subsidies. They're not talking about police budgets, right? That's not an excess. What is an excess is a type of person. It's locating that waste, that fraud, that abuse, and that excess within a specific person, right? That can be targeted and sorted out and highlighted and framed as the villain here, which often the real question isn't whether the government is spending too much, but who benefits when public spending is cut or when public spending is increased.
Yeah, the irony of these work requirements is that they often actually add to Medicaid budgets, right? That's like they're like it's millions of dollars, and then as you go deeper and like trying to implement them, it's like the costs just increase. It's kind of astounding.
Which again ties into this whole idea of like what they're actually going for when they say this is about fiscal responsibility. This is.
Or what fiscal responsibility
right, or
is.
like what fiscal responsibility even is.
You scratch a cost-cutting measure and Francis Galton bleeds. Or maybe Malthus, I guess.
Yes.
To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod. You'll get access to this and the rest of our catalog of patron-only episodes, and be the first to get a new patron episode every Monday when it drops. With love, the Death Panel.